Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, September 25th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Pennsylvania and the Republican primary that's set to take place next year to determine who will be the Republican nominee for governor in this state. Doug Mastriano is a name that might ring a bell. He's in the headline here and on screen right now because he was the Republican nominee for governor back in 2022 against then Attorney General Josh Shapiro in a race that was expected to be quite a good race for the Democratic Party, but to the degree at which Democrats had won by was not entirely expected until we reached Election Day, when Josh Shapiro defeated Doug Mastriano by roughly 15 points. Now, looking at the governor's race this time around, the Republican primary is quite complicated. For one hand, you do have Stacey Garrity, the incumbent Republican state treasurer, running for governor, but you also have Doug Mastriano, who has been quite public about his idea of running for governor in the state, criticizing the Pennsylvania Republicans for falling in line behind Stacey Garrity, saying that this is what makes Republican voters disillusioned with the process, a coronation, as he put it, in the GOP primary, when it really looks like he wants to run for governor himself. Now, he backtracked a little bit. When Doug Mastriano initially made a comment to the press, he said that if Stacey Garrity was to run for governor, that he would make the decision not to run against her. But as of late, on social media and to the press as well, has been very public that he is considering running for governor yet, and still believes and maintains that he thinks that he would defeat her in this upcoming election and would defeat Josh Shapiro in an inevitable general election in 2026. Now, Doug Mastriano is in a really interesting position as someone who came off a 15-point loss just 4 years ago. Republican primary voters don't seem to keep that in consideration, as right now he leads Stacey Garrity, against her in a head-to-head primary, which is very interesting. A 39-20 advantage, a 19-point margin, is one that I really didn't expect to see in this state. My ultimate take was that Pennsylvania was one that really did prioritize winning and cared about getting through the election, rather than someone on the ideological spectrum that you might be more aligned with, like Doug Mastriano. Saving Doug Mastriano's race, pulling that out of the equation in 2024, Pennsylvania Republicans actually did quite well. Thinking about 2022 versus 2024, massive differences here, but it seems as if they had, at least to some degree, learned their lesson. In the Attorney General's race, they won by 5 points. In the Auditor General race, they won by 5 points. In the Treasurer race, they won by 7 points. And when it came down to the presidential race and the Senate election, they defeated a longtime incumbent, Bob Casey, who was a very well-known name across the state of Pennsylvania. But also on the presidential level, Donald Trump defeated Kamala Harris by nearly double the margin that he defeated Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. And so thinking about, not only the 2024 cycle, but what 2026 might end up with if Republicans are to move forward with Doug Mastriano over Stacey Garrity, this race is wraps. I honestly am of the opinion that Stacey Garrity is not as strong of a contender as some of the Republicans would like to believe in this state. She really is the only Republican besides Mastriano who's willing to throw away her position and instead run for governor. And I say that because even when it came down to Donald Trump's endorsement of Dan Mueser, who is the congressman right now from one of the districts in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's 9th district, a huge advocate for Donald Trump, received the endorsement from Donald Trump, but decided that rather than fail in his bid for governor against Josh Shapiro, he instead would decide to run for re-election in the House of Representatives. And that's really where you start to see, Stacey Garrity came into this, does not have the Trump endorsement, but has the endorsement of Dan Mueser, who has the Trump endorsement, has the endorsement of the Pennsylvania Republican Party. But even with all of this name ID backing Stacey Garrity, Doug Mastriano still leads. Now, this is not the first time, though, that Pennsylvania Republicans have chosen bad candidates. I said after 24, you would think that they would prioritize electability above else, but that's not always the case. And in Pennsylvania, we saw in the 22 midterms, Doug Mastriano was a bad choice, but so was Dr. Oz in the state, who went on to lose to John Fetterman in this race by roughly 5 points in a state that arguably should have maintained its status as a Republican hold, given that Senator Pat Toomey, who was the retiring Republican incumbent in this race, was an outgoing member of the GOP. And thinking about the fact that Dr. Oz went on to lose this race, well, no shot, right? Thinking about that, Dr. Oz as a Republican nominee for Senate, it was never going to pan out. And so Doug Mastriano, again, I'm getting back to this point where it feels very circular, where we're looking back to the 22 cycle, seeing how much of a failure it was on the side of the Republicans when they nominated Mastriano, how much damage he did down ballot in Pennsylvania as well. I mean, it isn't just contained to the governor's election, but Republicans did a lot better in 2024 under the same House boundaries, largely because Doug Mastriano carried them down in 2022. right? Republicans were at 8 seats, Democrats were at 9. Now Democrats are at 7, and Republicans are at 10 in the state. I mean, you see here that there was a pretty notable shift away from the Democratic Party, and a lot of it had to do with the fact at the top of the ticket, the Senate elections, the House, the governor election, translating down ballot to negative results for the GOP, because running for governor is one of the most visible things that you can do. You are representing the slate of candidates at the top, right? People are often turning out to vote for governor, turning out to vote for Senate, to a lesser extent, state legislative elections, congressional elections such as the House races. More so, they are turning out for the Senate and governor races. And when you have two very bad candidates on the Republican side who are running for governor and running for Senate, turning out and turning up on the national level and being, this center-focused piece for the Pennsylvania GOP, when people thought of the Pennsylvania Republicans in 2022, they were thinking about Dr. Oz and they were thinking about Doug Mastriano, both of them extraordinarily unappealing candidates. And now in 2026, the Democrats have lucked out that they don't have to worry about a competitive Senate race because John Fetterman's not up until 2028. But that means the governor's race is going to be front and center, and that means Doug Mastriano, more likely than not, if he decides to run, will also be front and center yet again and probably do a lot of damage to the GOP. Because if you were just to shift this map by 5 points towards the left, the map looks like this, with Democrats at 10 seats and Republicans at 7. So seeing this come and map out into reality, if the map just shifts 5 points away from where it was in 2024, when Donald Trump won Pennsylvania by roughly, 2 points here, if you go back and swing it over to Democrats winning statewide by 3, God forbid, on the national level, an even bigger swing, and God forbid for Doug Mastriano and the GOP's sake, that Josh Shapiro was ushering in a 15, 20-point victory, even larger than what he saw in 2022, the damage will be done in the House elections and the state legislative elections, where there will be a real tangible impact of a second bid for governor from Doug Mastriano. And thinking, too, just again about what this primary poll has also suggested, which is that, ultimately speaking, when it comes down to the approval rating of Josh Shapiro, 27% of likely GOP primary voters have a positive view of Shapiro. For context, with Donald Trump, amongst Democratic primary voters, you're talking about maybe 5 to 6%. So roughly 1 in 4 Republicans in the state of Pennsylvania have a positive view of their Democratic governor. Josh Shapiro, we've known, has been this very strong presence in the state, extraordinarily popular. And we see that here, through and through, in the data that is being put forth, the same data that is also telling us and raising alarm bells here for the Republicans when it comes down to this GOP primary. Because if it really is Doug Mastriano, this election truly has been spoken for already, right? Josh Shapiro will blow Doug Mastriano out of the water every single time. It'll be a 99 to 1% chance that Josh Shapiro wins re-election. And again, thinking about what it looked like in 2022, can you only imagine if the national environment shifts in favor of the Democratic Party even further, right? Think about what the governor election in Pennsylvania looked like in 22 when Biden was down 10 points. Democrats were negative in the generic ballot. Republicans won the popular vote, and they did very well in a variety of elections. Obviously, the Senate races swung away from them, but when it came down to House elections, right, Republicans didn't do amazingly, but they did well, right? They won back control of the House of Representatives. And so Josh Shapiro, going on to win by 15 points against Doug Mastriano, the same Doug Mastriano, who, might I add, when we were seeing what the race was looking like months in advance, it didn't look super bad for Mastriano at the very beginning. But then people started to learn more about him. The data at initial glance, when you take a look at what it said early on, was that maybe Shapiro was going to be in for a more competitive race, right? The data in June and July had said, yes, Shapiro's in the advantage, but for instance, Suffolk University had him up by 4. Signal had him up by 3, right? A bunch of these different groups. Fabrizio Ward and Impact Research, a firm that works together. Fabrizio Ward was Trump's pollster. Impact Research was one of Kamala's pollsters. They came together in 22, also Biden as well. They do their own nonpartisan pollsters, because they're fielded to do this race. They found Shapiro was only ahead by 3, and that's because a lot of the voters only knew Mastriano as the Republican nominee for governor. It had a lot less to do with, whether or not he was good or bad. It was just they knew he was the Republican nominee. Shapiro was the Democratic nominee, and Pennsylvania, as always, was a battleground and more of a toss-up. And even as we got closer to the election, Emerson College had it within 3, right? YouGov and CBS was where we really started to see the numbers start to expand. Then Monmouth solidified it. Even Trafalgar couldn't find Josh Shapiro leading. And then by the time we had reached the final stages of the election, Fabrizio and Ward, which, did polling earlier on, you remember they were the ones that showed Shapiro up by 3. They did their final poll of the cycle on October 4th through 12th, which found that Shapiro was ahead by 11, right? And all of these other data points that by the time we reached the election ended up being right in predicting a pretty massive victory for Josh Shapiro over Doug Mastriano. Even Trafalgar got worse for Doug Mastriano, and Marist College was right on the money, 54-40, when the actual result here, when we look back here, was 57-42. So very, very strong numbers for Shapiro, even weaker ones on that end. If you're going to look at the complete other side of the spectrum, Mastriano lost a lot of support. And when we saw that the numbers here looked okay for Mastriano, the real question here was, if Republicans were to try to hammer in this candidacy, it was only going to do them more damage. They actually benefited more by voters knowing less about Doug Mastriano, and that really was the big strategy from the Shapiro campaign and the Democratic Party, which was to elevate the positions and the stances of Mastriano as being pro-life with no exceptions. January 6th, the 10D, all of these different things where he had a lot of baggage, arguably, right? In the height of the Dobbs decision, thinking about the way that voters in 2022 were, especially how different they were to the 2024 electorate. Democrats did a lot right, but Republicans largely abandoned Mastriano in this race because they knew that any money being spent on the race would largely be useless. Thinking about the amount of money that Shapiro had versus Doug Mastriano, this was not an accident. When the RGA chair at the time, I believe it was Governor Doug Ducey, correct me if I'm wrong, was on CNN. I remember watching this live, actually. He was asked about whether or not there would be investments in the Pennsylvania governor's race, as there were some data points indicating that the race might be more competitive. And Doug Mastriano actually went over to Colorado Springs and campaigned to the RGA, begging them and pleading them to invest in his race, making the argument that there was reason to spend money on Pennsylvania, as Biden had only won the state by 1. Trump had won it 4 years prior. I mean, there had been all these arguments made, but the RGA chair told CNN that the RGA is only willing to invest in races that they can actually win. And it was at that point that we knew that they were ceding complete and total ground to Josh Shapiro. He out-fundraised Doug Mastriano by a margin, massive amounts, nearly 10-1 when it came down to the amount of money that Shapiro was reeling in versus Mastriano. And he already was the attorney general at the time, won election in 2016, won re-election in 2020, did a larger margin than Biden when it came across the state, and then went into this governor's race and won by a very, very large margin. And thinking about the fact that Republicans want to put Mastriano back in the driver's seat on the GOP side, it's arguably laughable. It really begs the question, ultimately speaking, is Mastriano doing this as a bit? Because there is just no real reason that Republicans, one, should nominate him. There's no real reason that he should even be running in the first place. And yet somehow he finds himself back in this position where he's winning amongst the GOP primary voters. He's at 39%, and just to do a little bit of flashback, nearly identical to the margin that he received in the actual vote in 2022, when he won 44% of the vote, to Lou Barletta, who was at 21%. Nearly identical in terms of, what is happening here, with 39% preferring Mastriano, with 20% going to Stacey Garrity. So we'll see. This election is a while away. The 2026 midterms are going to be, closer than we think, but still certainly a lot of time for Doug Mastriano to drop and say, I'm not going to run for this race. Stacey Garrity to expand, for Donald Trump to, put his foot on the scale in this race, because ultimately this race is one that, if it maintains itself, and Josh Shapiro is up against Doug Mastriano yet again, and we are back to a rematch of 2022, not only will Josh Shapiro be the favorite to win this race, and right now he already absolutely is. Some of these ratings he's receiving when it comes down to a race where we don't even know who the Republicans are going to nominate, he's just that popular of a candidate, is actually performing better, right? Inside Elections in 22 had him at lean Democrat. In 2026, they already have him at likely, right? When you're looking at some of these numbers too, Real Clear Politics had him at lean. These numbers here are looking a lot better for Shapiro, and that's before the Republicans have even made a decision. If it is, in fact, Doug Mastriano for governor on the Republican side, this race immediately moves to safe for the Democratic Party. And 2026 in Pennsylvania will be nothing more than Republicans clawing and trying to find their way in House races that will be inevitably impacted negatively by a Mastriano candidacy, just as it was in the 2022 midterm elections. So keep your eyes peeled in 2026. Let's watch this GOP primary, because it could make or break the governor's race. Ultimately, though, Josh Shapiro has the upper hand against anybody, but even more against Doug Mastriano, just as he did in 2022. 2022. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.